While the college football world has completely changed their mind about how good Indiana football can be, I still have some things I want to see against the Hawkeyes this weekend. But let's just be honest, Indiana's going to crush Iowa.
You are Locked On Hoosiers, your daily podcast on the Indiana Hoosiers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, welcome in. I'm Trent Condon. That's Jacob Goins, and this is a crossover edition, Locked On Hawkeyes and Locked On Hoosiers. Thanks for making Locked On Hawkeyes or Hoosiers your first listen every day. We're available wherever you find podcasts. You can also watch us on YouTube. I've been covering the Hawkeyes for over 20 years on the radio. Jacob, a longtime Hoosier fan and broadcaster, and glad to have you aboard with us here today. Today's episode is brought to you by Mazda. Like our players, we sweat every detail because when you make every move count, pulling off the unexpected is only the beginning. Stay tuned later for highlights in this week's Moving the Game Forward. Mazda, move and be moved. Jacob, good to see you once again. Here we go. It is a big week in an old Big Ten rivalry that we just haven't seen a whole lot. Kind of crazy that this is the first game since 2021 between these two teams. One of the few times that the Hoosiers came in ranked, and Iowa blew them off the field. But this Indiana team certainly feels much different than that one. Let's open up today, since this is a crossover, and just an overview. I'm sure most everybody was able to see Saturday night and what the Hoosiers did against Illinois. I went back, watched those condensed versions of their first couple of games of the season. A lot to be excited about. So for the Hawkeye side of things, how would you kind of rate, or how would you just describe what we've seen here for you guys during the first 4 games of the year?
Well, you mentioned it, and it's good to be back on with you and have you on for Locked On Hoosiers as well. You mentioned the fact that everybody in the country got to see what Indiana was truly about last Saturday against Illinois, because it was one of the biggest games of the week. It's truly one of the biggest games of the year up to that point. And the fact that it was on national television, all the other night games weren't really that good, right? Florida, Miami was a snooze fest, and some of the other games were just not that entertaining. So most people turned on Indiana versus Illinois and got to see that the Hoosiers are legit, because everybody knows Indiana made the playoff last year, and everybody knows that Curt Cignetti's a really good coach, and there were a bunch of new guys coming in through the transfer portal. But I guess the consensus across the country was, Indiana can't do it again, right? The inevitable step back year. No way that they're able to be good again. And playing 3 cupcakes to start the season, you didn't really know, right? Nobody really trusted Indiana or knew how good they could be until you dismantle a top 10 team like you did against Illinois 63-10. So that's where a lot of the confidence this week, Trent, is coming from, is the idea that Indiana proved it against a good opponent and the whole country got to see it.
On Iowa's side of things, it has been a tumultuous start, I would say, to the season. Though they're sitting here at this point with just 1 loss on the resume, the loss to Iowa State still lingers. Definitely first time losing a name since 2011. And Iowa went out and they spent in the portal, and they brought in a quarterback that was hopeful that was going to cure the ills that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years. The quarterback position had just been such a quagmire for Iowa. And Mark Gronowski, game 1 against Albany. It's Albany, right? A bad FCS team.
Right.
And he didn't look good. And then he goes to Ames. And though he looked a little bit better, he still didn't look very good. But the last couple of weeks, it feels like that maturation is happening. Now, I think Hoosier fans also need to realize Mark Gronowski, one of the most celebrated players in the portal. Remember, this is the guy Miami wanted before they eventually got Carson Beck. So it shows you that Gronowski, but he missed all spring football. He had surgery on his shoulder, missed all his spring football, was slow coming back. And the reports we continue to get during August camp was it wasn't going very well. That shaking off the rust was maybe taking a little bit longer. That has dissipated these last couple of weeks. Ran the ball effectively. Now was against UMass in game number 3. You don't want to read too much into that. And I think that's the caveat that we put into it. But then last week against Rutgers, at least a Big Ten team that's kind of at minimum going to be flirting with bowl eligibility and definitely has some dudes. He looked like the guy that Iowa thought they were going to get. There's still some warts throwing the football. This is not an elite guy. This is not a guy that processes, but the biggest difference maker that he is what he does with his legs. And as we get to the game on Saturday, that's something I think we're going to talk about more, because the importance of him being able to run the football, and not you think about an Antoine Randall, right? That's not the kind of running quarterback that he is. This is a guy that does it with power. He was called the Tim Tebow of the FCS, and you can definitely see it. 6'4", 230 pounds. He is big. He is physical. He'll lay a guy out, and he makes plays. 3rd and 1 used to be a disaster for Iowa. Not the case anymore. 4th and 1, when you have the capability of a physical running quarterback, that has really helped out this Iowa offense. So that's where we are at this point. But with one loss already on the resume, this is a huge game for Iowa. A season ago, they came in with a lot of aspirations. A lot of people had them top 20 team coming into the year, had 2 early losses, and after that, it was, it's not going to be a college football playoff team, kind of what we are. If they take another loss here in September, I think a lot of those conversations are going to continue. So that's a look at where we are here the first couple of weeks of the season. Should be a fun one. I want to take it this direction. Jacob, my listeners know, and my everyday listeners know, I'm a degenerate gambler. I gamble every single day. And that is something that is very big in my world, that when looking at games also, it brings up an interesting point, because what we saw Saturday, the domination from Indiana, how they're playing, some of their strengths and weaknesses, and we're going to talk about those a little bit later on. But the point spread gives me hope that this is going to be a game, both just as a gambler, taking the Iowa angle away from it, but seeing the opening line that came out from FanDuel. They had this thing in their look-ahead line Friday night before Iowa Rutgers. They had it Indiana by 3. And to Saturday night, and after the games conclude, I saw they rehung it, and it was 6.5 and quickly went to 7.5. Yet the sharpest book out there, Circa Sports, they still opened it Sunday after DraftKings, FanDuel, some of the big books out there. They still had it Indiana -4, which shows you the Vegas numbers, the power numbers do not have the Hoosiers quite at that level. That everything went well Saturday night, and maybe there's some overreaction in the market, and that's one thing. Betting public is all over Indiana. Nobody wants to take the Hawkeyes this weekend. I personally, as a gambler, love this spot.
Yeah, and you see this so often, right? Because I dabble into the gambling scene as well, and you see the public, because the public is the public. They just watch games when they want to. A lot of them are box score viewers, and whoa, 63-10, Indiana's a world beater. Indiana, I mean, they're gonna smoke Iowa, right? That's what most of the public wants to think and talk about. I think Indiana wins, and I think Indiana can cover a 3, 4, or a 7-point spread. But you see the public just jump on a team that played really well last week because they feel they can do it again this week. So the betting line moving all over the place has worried me a little bit, because Trent, I always say the buildings in Vegas are nice for a reason. They don't just, they didn't just show up there and have a loan. They paid for those pretty quickly out there, because those guys know what they're doing in terms of putting these spreads out. Our friends at FanDuel have it at 7.5 as we speak, going into Friday, possibly Saturday as well. We'll see where some of those big money spenders come in right before kickoff, which is something that's really big. But look, I think Indiana can cover just about any spread that it ends up being, but you have to avoid the letdown. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But that's the concern for me. Can Indiana avoid the letdown, not listen to people who are backing them, and just play Hoosier football? Because if they do, they should beat Iowa on Saturday.
Let's get into that. Let's talk about the strengths, the weaknesses. How does Iowa slow this Indiana train down? And the Kinnick Stadium factor. I see some of you Hoosiers starting to overlook that a little bit. We're going to get into that as we continue. It's a crossover edition, Locked On Hawkeyes and Locked On Hoosiers.
Today's episode of Locked On Hoosiers is brought to you by Mazda's, moving the game forward for those who believe it's not just about playing the game, it's about redefining it. There are moments that do more than put points on the board. They move crowds, they move culture, and keep moving the game forward. This week's moment that moved the game forward is D'Angelo Pons' punt block in return for a touchdown. You can also pick just the bounce back play from the defense. How about 7 sacks, right? For the Indiana defense. Also had an interception in there as well. I mean, you really just got to do it all if you were this Indiana football team a week ago against Illinois, and you're going to have it this weekend against the Iowa Hawkeyes. And so you got to have moments that move you forward. You got to have moments that really change the game for you and your team, and you can do that as well by driving a Mazda. When you follow what moves you, the unexpected is only the beginning, and just like there's more to every highlight, there's more to a Mazda vehicle. Mazda, move and be moved.
Trent Condon, Jacob Goins back with you on a crossover edition. Locked on Hawkeyes, Locked on Hoosiers. Make sure you hit subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube. If you're on the podcast side, 5-star reviews helps us get in front of more Hawkeye fans and get in front of some Hoosier fans as well. All right, Jacob, let's get back into this matchup. And going through, I mentioned, watched the non-conference games.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I guess I was a little surprised because I didn't watch start to finish, but watched a lot of it. Got the multi-TV set up down here in the man cave. So
you didn't watch Indiana's full game against Indiana State, Trent? What do you come on a Friday night? You didn't have anything better to do?
No. I was broadcasting high school football that night, but I did watch those condensed versions, and they're 20 minutes, something like that on YouTube. But certainly the first two games, especially even the blowout at Kennesaw State, that was a relatively close game there, middle of the third quarter before things opened up. Because of what I saw Saturday night, I thought I was going to be more impressed by Indiana, and I walked away from those games, not including the Indiana State game, but the first two, maybe a little bit more. This is Indiana, and they're playing incredibly well. But to replicate what they did Saturday night is difficult to do. We know college football, right? Mm-hmm. To do that week after week is incredibly difficult. And going through, looking at those games, looking at the numbers, it's hard to come up with something realistic that, oh boy, this is an easy weakness to point to for this Indiana team. But you watch closer than I do. So if you had to come up with something, give the Hawkeye fans out there something that they could cling on to. Maybe this could be the weakness that I could try to exploit.
Look, it's hard to find it. And I believe Kirk Ferentz even had a quote this week saying it's hard to find a weakness about this Indiana team because you see when they're playing at their best in all facets of the game, they can do what they did last week against Illinois. And I do want to clear up this idea that Indiana's going to do that every week. It's just not going to happen, especially this week on the road against an Iowa team. First road game of the year. We'll talk about Kinnick Stadium and how crazy that place can get here momentarily, but there's just not a whole lot of weaknesses here for this Indiana team. If there is, maybe defensive depth, right? You're looking at some injuries in the secondary, a couple of guys in the linebacker room who you're still trying to work into a rotation. The starters are good, and the two deep is really solid, but maybe some defensive depth or maybe even running the football consistently with your running backs and just trying to create some of those holes. And look, I understand that Indiana's going up against an offensive and defensive line for Iowa that grade out extremely well thanks to PFF. I mean, both of those, that's what Iowa's built on, right, Trent? I'm not telling you or your listeners anything they don't know. That's what Iowa does, is have the big boys up front and keep you in ball games. But Indiana is solid at every spot. And speaking of the depth in the secondary, to be particular, Indiana just won a huge legal battle this week with Lewis Moore, starting safety, who was still fighting eligibility. Trent, he played the first 4 games of the year, was still fighting eligibility with the NCAA. He found a judge in Texas that claimed his 2 years in JUCO doesn't count. The Diego Pavia rule come into effect. And so Indiana starting safety will play the rest of the season. So that's a huge get. That's a huge bonus, really, for Indiana. And so I think depth on defense, maybe running the football against Iowa in particular could be tough, but man, Indiana's playing really, really well. And I'll flip it back to you and talking about Iowa. I look at the Hawkeyes and just being honest, I'm struggling to find an area where they could have the advantage over Indiana in this football game because the defensive and offensive lines for the Hoosiers are much better than they were a year ago. So let's flip it to you. Tell me a spot for Iowa that I might be overlooking where they could have the advantage on Saturday.
I think the biggest one, and it's something that we talk about seemingly every week for Iowa in matchups like this, is they have to dominate special teams. Not just win special teams, but dominate.
Good point.
Caden Weegan, 95-yard punt return a couple of weeks ago. Last week opened up the game with a 104-yard kick return. He is outstanding. He is one of the best returners year after year. He was a returner of the year in the country last season, the Jet Award winner. So Caden Weegan, as a returner, he's a difference maker. And he had the worst game of his career against Iowa State. And because of that, since he's bounced back, he's been incredible since then. So you have that advantage. In terms of kicking, Drew Stevens is outstanding. An incredibly strong leg. Has kicked a couple of 54-yarders so far this season, has a 55-yarder in his career, and every one of those long kicks kicks he has made with distance. I mean, there is a realistic possibility we could be talking about a 60, 61 yarder without fail for
Wow.
Drew Stevens. He is one of the best kickers in the country, though. There has been some operational things. They do have a long snapper that came in from Boston College. A couple of concerns there to keep your eye on. Punting in his second year, Reese Dakin, another Australian punter, coming in for Torrey Taylor. He's been okay this year, but I think there's a lot more, and we certainly saw that a season ago out of Dakin. Coverage units every single year are really good. That's rarely a problem. LeVar Woods, former Hawkeye linebacker, he is the special teams coordinator, one of the best in the country. Tampa Bay Buccaneers tried to hire him last year. He is one of the best out there. So that would be the one that I point to.
Okay.
Iowa's got to make a couple things happen, right? They got to get a turnover. Something goofy's got to happen.
Right.
And dominate special teams. That's how Iowa closes the gap. And, for years and years when we've gone through Iowa and the struggles offensively and all those different things, that was one thing that people so rarely looked at on the national and even the regional scene, is how Iowa would win games by dominating special teams. So that would be one place that I would look to. Iowa have an advantage there. I know last week, punt block for Indiana, so they're going to be buttoned up there, but I saw a missed kick. What was the kick? Maybe it was the Old Dominion game that hit the crossbar on the long one at the end of the half, like a 48-yard or something like that. So that's an area that I think Iowa can close the gap between the two.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring up special teams, because I'm not concerned about Indiana's special teams in terms of the kicking game yet. It's just something that, and this is going to sound cocky when I say it, and I don't mean it to sound this way, Indiana just hasn't kicked a whole lot this year.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't kicked a bunch of field goals. They haven't punted the ball a bunch of times. They didn't do that last year either. And Radicic, our place kicker, he's 30 for 30 on extra points. That tells you he just hasn't kicked a whole lot of field goals, 3 or 4 maybe this year that he's attempted. Like, it just hasn't happened all that often. So if Iowa can get some stops on defense and force Indiana to do things that they're not comfortable with, that's absolutely an area that Iowa could take advantage. And I'm glad you brought up the punt block return for a touchdown. That really helped Indiana get back in that football game and allowed them to kind of kickstart that and get things going. And after that, it kind of was over. And so special teams could be a spot that Iowa dominates. And for Indiana, again, on the road for the first time this season, if the offense isn't clicking, you're going to have to rely on your kicking unit. And Indiana just hasn't had to do it all that much.
So one other factor that I think both teams need to have something in the back pocket is Indiana's going on the road for the first time. Mm-hmm. And as we saw a year ago, this team was much different on the road. Now, opponents were also different for them a season ago, but going to Notre Dame, going to Ohio State, Kinnick Stadium, there is a reason that Kinnick Stadium is known as one of the most difficult places to play in the country, and it's because it's a great venue. It is incredibly loud, even though just 70,000 seats. It's not a behemoth like the Big House, but I've been to both places, and it's not even close. Iowa is much louder than it is at Michigan Stadium. And the same thing, the proximity to the sideline, you are right up against there. There is not much room, and you're going to have those fans in their ear all game long talking to them. It's a different kind of venue. It's going to be charged up. On top of 4 consecutive home games for Indiana. Still, though there are some new faces there, that offensive line going through that the first time and going through in the cadences now with Mendoza going through it. I think it's a factor that sometimes does get overlooked, and certainly doing it for the first time in the season.
Yeah, and Indiana can't really look back on last year's experience and help themselves here. And I know that doesn't directly correlate, but Indiana's first road trip last year, Trent, was to UCLA, to the Rose Bowl, to a bad team, a bad atmosphere, and Indiana probably had more fans there than UCLA did. So you can't really look back on that and say, we did it last year, we're fine. This is probably the 3rd toughest road game you're going to play all year. The atmosphere could be the 2nd, but the team obviously just not up to the level of Oregon and Penn State yet that Indiana has to also travel to. So you got to find a way to get some rhythm here. Hopefully you do perform well and can build on that, because you do go to Autzen, you do go to Happy Valley as well. Indiana has to come out and play smooth. You mentioned turnovers earlier. Indiana hasn't done that yet. Mendoza hasn't turned it over. Running backs are holding on to the football. Hopefully my broadcaster's jinx doesn't come out and spoil this team, but it's going to be difficult, and Indiana's going to have to find ways to communicate, operate, and just move the football down the field in a really, really hostile environment.
So we have that component to it, and Iowa's done this before, and we call it the Kirk special, being able to find a way. I go back to some of the big upsets that Iowa's pulled in the past, and you go back to 2016. That's one of the biggest ones. Second ranked Michigan comes to town. They're beating teams by, I think, an average of like 38 points a game at that point. They're 9-0. They're second in the country. Iowa's coming on the heels of looking awful the week before against Penn State. They allowed the Nittany Lions that week on the road to rack up 600 yards of total offense. Iowa comes back. They ugly it up. They win it on a walk-off 14-13. Now, when you look back at a lot of these upsets and really outside of the win against Ohio State 55-24, they're normally the low-scoring, ugly kind of slugfest game. That's my concern here. I don't think there is a path for Iowa to win this game 17-13, 20-17. I think the Hawkeyes, if they're going to pull the upset, it's going to have to look different. They're going to have to score and win this game.
Because Indiana's going to score. I mean, I'm going to be honest. Iowa has a solid defense, but Indiana just has too many weapons on the offensive side of the football, with Mendoza leading the way. The offensive line was rebuilt this year in the transfer portal and has performed well so far. The receivers on the outside, I mean, between Elijah Surratt and Omar Cooper, they're two of the best receivers in the Big Ten, on top of guys like E.J. Williams and Bonds, and even the tight ends are getting involved as well with Nowakowski and Holden Stays. And so on top of your running back room, that's kind of by rotation right now, Indiana's too good offensively, just speaking honestly here, to be stopped for 4 quarters. Iowa, when they get those stops, they're going to have to take advantage because, again, I believe in Indiana to move the football and score when they have to win this football game.
Well, from there, we continue. It's time to get into our predictions, what we think we're going to see in this football game coming up. 2:30 kickoff Central Time, 3:30 Eastern on Peacock. Now that's its own set of issues. We'll talk about it. Our predictions plus a little basketball talk, as we got more connections happening here. Jacob's excited about his team. I'm excited about our team. We'll talk about that as we continue. Hoops and prediction time when we come back. It's a crossover edition of Locked On Hawkeyes and Locked On Hoosiers.
Today's episode of Locked On Hoosiers is brought to you by DoorDash. It's almost the weekend. Time to look back and crown this week's MVP on Who Delivered, powered by DoorDash. Just like you can win every Saturday with DoorDash Streaks, saving more every time that you order. These players delivered when it matters most. Let's break it down. And is it too easy to say that it's Fernando Mendoza? Is it too easy to say that he was one of the main reasons that you just absolutely stomped on Illinois last week inside of Memorial Stadium for a guy that went, 21 of 23, 267 yards, 5 passing touchdowns for Fernando Mendoza? Man, we'd love to see him do that again against Iowa, wouldn't we? He was absolutely the guy that delivered for Indiana, and DoorDash delivers on Saturdays. With DoorDash Streaks, you save every Saturday that you order, stack it up all season, and you could save up to $250, including $100 in DoorDash credits. Order this Saturday, keep the streak alive, and fuel your game day only with DoorDash. Terms apply. Promo period runs through November 18th. Today's episode of Locked On Hoosiers is brought to you by 5-Hour Energy. Caffeine just got a flavor upgrade. 5-Hour Energy shots deliver tasty caffeine in 17 bold flavors. Each 2-ounce shot packs the caffeine of a premium 12-ounce cup of coffee, plus B vitamins and nutrients with 0 sugar and 0 crashes. What I love most is how portable that they are. Big taste and a tiny shot. You can take it anywhere and get that boost when you need it. I'm not lying when I tell you, when I'm calling games or going to do my radio show or just working at the office or even working here at home, I have them everywhere, in my backpack, in my desk drawer. I keep them in my car. I always want one just in case for Friday night lights, or maybe that Tuesday night basketball game, or staying up late doing some podcasts for you. 5-Hour Energy shots are quick, they're easy, and I'm telling you, they really do give me the boost that I need. So enough with the boring, flavorless caffeine. It's time to give your caffeine a flavor upgrade with 5-Hour Energy shots. Get the favorite you love, or be bold and try something new in store and online at www.5hourenergy.com or on Amazon today.
Trent Condon, Jacob Goins back with you one final time. Crossover edition of Locked On Hawkeyes and Locked On Hoosiers. All right, Jacob, here we go. Before we get to our predictions and how we think this game is going to play out, just a little bit of hoops. Obviously, DeVries going there. There are plenty of Hawkeye fans and plenty of Hawkeye money and decision makers that thought that he was going to be the next coach for the Hawkeyes after they dismissed Fran McCaffrey. Obviously, the connections to the state, growing up in the state, And a lot of people believe that that was the apple of his eye. But here comes Indiana, not just with the prestige, the national championships, Indiana basketball in general, but also what they can spend and what they can do.
Yeah.
And I think that was a big difference maker there. Yet the Iowa side of things, they're happy, I think, with the way that this played out. And you're going to find a very, very small percentage of the population that would have preferred now, after getting to know Ben McCollum, DeVries over him. So let's take it your way first, though. The excitement of DeVries in year number one and kind of what the expectation level is over at IU.
Oh, I'll say this first. I think Ben McCollum's a really good coach, and he was in the mix to get the Indiana job. He was one of these several names that Indiana was considering tossing around. One of the more fun coaching searches I've covered, not just for Indiana, but just in general. Just some of the names that were floating around. Some were legit, others were not, as you know. But look, I think Ben McCollum's a really, really good coach, and I think he's going to make Iowa a competitor again and a contender again in the Big Ten and on the national stage. But for Indiana, Darren DeVries was a mixed review hire. I'll be completely honest with you, because some people knew who he was, others really didn't. And I don't say that disrespectfully. It's just, it wasn't the lead name that a lot of people had in mind. But I think now that he's been hired, and you go back and look at his resume, you go back and look at what his reputation is, the way he coaches and the way his teams perform, it's a complete 180 Trent, from what Indiana's been doing the last several years, which is just dump it down in the paint, score 60 points a game, can't make a three, don't run, defense is terrible, and that's just not good basketball, which is why the Hoosiers have missed the tournament again this past year, and you let go of your head coach, an Indiana legend in Mike Woodson, one who was beloved by Coach Knight. So you go and get Darren DeVries, who's going to run up and down the floor. They're going to play defense, and this team's going to shoot a bunch of threes. But you had to rebuild the team from scratch. You know how many players are returning to Indiana's roster this year who played a single minute last year? Zero. Not a single player is coming back from last year. And you expect that with a coaching change, but that's really tough to do. And so DeVries had to rebuild in the transfer portal. I think he did. I won't go super in detail of all the players because that could take forever. But I think the excitement level is there. He's going to have to start winning some recruiting battles. But just be honest with you, he's missed out on a couple already early. And you expect that. He's got to get some film on the floor, I guess, for some of these recruits at Indiana to convince them to come to Bloomington. But I'm excited for him, and I think most of the fans are as well.
On the Iowa side, you mentioned Ben McCollum, and he hit the ground running. Talk about winning the press conference, and there was some murmurs. You know, the slowdown style, Iowa tried that with Todd Licklider, who was an unmitigated disaster. I mean, as unkempt of a Power 5 conference basketball coach as you're going to find, he was awful in so many ways. And Iowa fans were scared because Fran McCaffrey delivered them back to respectability, got them back to being a tournament team, being what Iowa basketball at least was in the 90s, where they get to the tournament most years, win a game, but that was the ceiling. And that's where the frustration started to build during the 90s and led to Steve Alford, who sucked and was a terrible person on top of it. Then Todd Licklider, who took it to another level. And Fran got them back to respectability. But you hit that ceiling. And when you hit that ceiling and you can't make stops defensively and you can't do anything more than maybe win a game in the tournament, frustration happens. And we saw what happened there. Yep. Ben McCollum is an Iowa guy. He hit all the right notes at the opening press conference. He brings in an All-American and maybe the second best point guard, not just in the Big Ten in the country. And Bennett starts with him from Drake. This is a guy that, you know, is projected as a lottery pick, as a 23-year-old, unheard of in next year's NBA draft. And there's a couple of mocks that have him at that level. Brings kind of 4 guys with him from Drake, team that pushed Texas Tech and had Texas Tech on the ropes in the second round game a season ago, plus what they did in the portal, brought in a couple of nice pieces there. The expectations for Iowa in year number 1, I think, are relatively high. Get to the tournament, win a game. I think that's where they are in year number 1 because you have Bennett Sturtz. And that's the great kind of differentiator. When you have a point guard like that, and Iowa hasn't had a point guard of this ilk. If it turns out to be this is probably Andre Woolridge. I mean, that's how far back you have to go. Jeff Horner was a nice player. Dean Oliver was a nice player. If Bennett Sturtz is, you know, even on the fringes of an All-American, that's something that Iowa hasn't had in the point guard spot in a really long time. So expectations are pretty high here, and we'll get to basketball season before we know it, and we'll do another crossover edition. But before that, we do have football. And let's wrap things up with our prediction. Prediction time for this one. Jacob Goins, how does this thing play out?
Look, I think Iowa is going to keep this competitive. They're not going to roll over and let Indiana drop 63 on them and not be able to move the football. But I just think for a 4-quarter game, I think Indiana's just more talented. I think Indiana's deeper, and I think Indiana's better coached. And I think the dam will break in the second half of this game, and Indiana's offense will continue to move the ball. They're going to punch it in several times. And I think people still sleep somehow on this Indiana defense that just got after Luke Altmaier last week. 7 sacks as a team. I think they're going to be able to do that again this week against a really talented offensive line for Iowa, but a secondary that's just not going to give that Iowa offense much to work with. So I like somewhere in the 31 to 17, 31-14 range for Indiana. I think the Hoosiers win, and I think they cover.
I have Indiana winning this game. And in the preseason, I was not a believer, much like I wasn't a believer in Illinois. So it wasn't just you guys. It was those teams flash in the pan. We've seen it so often. I was dead wrong on the Hoosiers. Could not be more impressed than I was, obviously, Saturday night. Now, I do think that the crowd's going to be a factor. And I do think that Iowa does hang around in this game. Eventually, Indiana gets it done, but we're going to give Iowa the cover at minimum. I got the Hoosiers winning at 30-24. Iowa a little bit more offensively maybe than you guys think, but boy, I love where we are right now, this underdog role and the confidence of Indiana football. We'll see early evening on Saturday how this one plays up. Jacob, enjoyed it as always. Good talking to you, and we'll talk to you again down the road.
Yes, sir. Thank you, my friend. Always fun to talk to you.
Thanks for making Locked On Hawkeyes and Locked On Hoosiers your first listen every day. We'll talk to you again tomorrow. Until then, go Hawks and
Hoosiers.
What is that?